Welcome to the first episode of the weekly Resilience Talks hosted by the Euro-Atlantic Resilience Center. The Euro-Atlantic Resilience Center is an organization based in Bucharest, Romania, and it's designed to provide expertise in the field of resilience and to offer practical tools to EU and NATO member states. The center functions as a platform of communication between public authorities, academia, civil society, businesses, and any other relevant voice in the field. The mission of EARC is to scan as vast a horizon as possible, trying to anticipate the next major crisis, to prepare the society for the unexpected, and to identify the early warning signs. I'm your host, Cristian Ghita, and I'm delighted to talk about today's topic, absorbing the shock, societal resilience lessons from Ukraine, with our fantastic guests. Ionela Maria Ciolan is a Brussels-based foreign policy and security expert and board member of the Transatlantic Alumni Network. Until recently, Ionela worked as a research fellow at the European Policy Center think tank in Brussels. Ionela has a PhD degree on the Eastern Partnership between multilateralism and power politics. David Kapanadze is a former diplomat who served in the Georgian representations and embassies in Geneva, Bern, and Bucharest. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the Georgian Strategic Analysis Center. Louis Wierenga is a junior research fellow in comparative politics at the University of Tartu and also a lecturer at the Baltic Strategy Center. And he published papers focusing on radical right populism in Estonia and Latvia. Thank you all on behalf of EARC and on behalf of all our listeners for taking the time to join our talk. We have exciting topics for discussion: how values can help a nation remain well-oriented under extreme stress, how to thaw a frozen conflict, and how the West must remain clear-eyed about the threats to our own democratic resilience. With the help of our guests, we will look at these aspects and tally them against the Ukrainian experience of dealing with this tremendous shock of being invaded by the largest country in the world and having to fight against an army ranked by some as the second best in the world. Now, that rating might have changed in the meantime, but it's no mean task anyway. What Ukraine did on the battlefield, scoring major victories around Kyiv and Kharkiv, is absolutely amazing. But I will argue that an even more important victory is the way in which they have managed to keep their society cohesive, their government functional, and how they maintained throughout this ordeal the clarity of their purpose. Ionela, you are quite fond of this topic. Could you tell us more about the part played by the European values in Ukraine after 2014? Is it correct to assume that they are one of the most important ingredients for Ukraine's extraordinary resilience?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Shortly, the answer is yes, it is correct. The European values had and have an important symbol and also meaning in creating the European identity inside Ukraine and the European choice for their government. But let me tell you more about this subject, because I researched it for my PhD thesis, and I will give you some information and some data about the situation in Ukraine before the start of the war, because currently we see some news, but we have to let the experts analyze the data when the war will be finished or the situation will be a little bit clear. So as we see that the Ukrainian people and government are showing an important resilience, and this resilience was based on that 8 years warfare, hybrid warfare against the Russian aggression, because we have to keep in mind that between 2014 and between 24 February this year, Russia held a hybrid warfare against Ukraine with small fights in the Donbass area. So Ukraine wasn't in a, let's say, totally peaceful situation. They were still fighting somehow in propaganda, Russian propaganda, hybrid elements, cyber affairs. So there were a lot of elements within the country. We have to keep in mind that there, for me, from my research, there are like 4 main elements that helped the Ukrainian societal resilience to be formed. One is the fact that this period was a boost in the creation of the Ukrainian national identity, and also a boost in their European identity. It was a period for Ukrainians to feel more Ukrainian, because before 2014 there were people in the eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine who identified themselves mostly as Russian. But we see that after the annexation of Crimea, the war which was started in Donbass, then with all the Russian propaganda, and definitely now the war in Ukraine will somehow consolidated the Ukrainian national identity, and also strengthened the European identity, because it was perceived like the only rational choice for Ukraine at that moment, their Western perspective. In addition, I would like also to mention the fact that we also see a socialization of the European norms, values, and principles through the Eastern Partnership mechanism. It was also a period between 2014 and 2020, a period when the newly created association agreement and the deep comprehensive free trade area, and also the visa liberalization, basically become the fundamentals of the relations between the Ukraine with the European Union. And even though these documents are highly technical, the implementation of them became political goal, and it was a manifestation of the country's European choice, and basically an internalization of the European norms, ideas, principles within the Ukrainian society. We see an increasement in the Ukrainian society for civic activism, for social organizations, NGOs within the country. We see that the Ukrainian society passed through socialization all of these norms, and therefore we can observe that there are 3 main areas of socialization: an increased interest in having fair election, an increased role and voice of the civil society in the country, and strengthening of the national identity. So basically this helped a lot the country to prepare for this moment. And also we see that the national and local election in 2019 basically are a proof of the Euro-Atlantic orientation of the country. And when it comes to the national identity, we see that this self-identity and perceptions about themselves was basically created in opposition with the others. On one side, we have the positive other, which is the European Union, on which the Ukrainian society would like to accede. On the other side, we have the negative other, which is Russia. And all this main strategic communication and narratives, even in the media, was basically created on this paradigm. And I would also like to mention that this socialization process was not only a way to move forward or back towards the European path, but also was a reaction to the Russian aggression towards Ukraine. So we see that what Kremlin did was to strengthen more the European path of Ukraine. And also I would like to mention that Ukrainian society has a realistic understanding of the current domestic and external struggles of the European reform process, even before the war. within this period, and I did many field research in Ukraine for my thesis, and I had discussions with members of the Ukrainian society, from academia, think tanks, civil society, and I observed the fact that basically they founded and their civic activism voice, and they were very interested in strengthening the ties and also relations with other European countries. And basically, we see the fact that we have this socialization through cooperation. The visa liberalization helped a lot of Ukrainians to travel to Western countries. Also, the fact that there were there's a situation with Russia also basically put a stop on the commercial or business relationship with Moscow, and we saw that the main partner, economic partner and trade partner of Ukraine, it became the European Union. And what all these measures are very important, because basically at this moment, the moment before 24th of February 2022, there weren't a lot of interdependencies between Ukraine and Russia. So that's why it was easier for the Ukrainian society to basically resist. And I also would like to mention the fact that apart from the help that the European Union was providing to Ukraine by financial support within the Eastern Partnership mechanism, we also have the fact, the idea that in the past 8 years, Ukraine started to build its multi-vector foreign policy. And they also were interested in finding support and assistance of NATO. And here it's very important because NATO helped a lot Ukrainian army and military to prepare, and society to prepare to resist in a case of war. So we see these results, basically all those trainings that the Americans or the British were providing in Ukraine. We also see the bilateral relations with Turkey and also with China, showing some results on how Ukrainians are resisting nowadays. So yes, to conclude, Ukrainian choose the European path, and they are showing today that they are willing to die for their European path and for their beliefs of being and living in a democracy and for fighting for freedom and equality. This is not the first time when they are doing that. They also did that during the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, Euromaidan as we know it. And basically this are the main examples of the European feelings in Ukraine, the fact that they are willing to die for themselves and for the idea of Europe and European belongingness.
Thank you very much. And that's an idea that is so powerful, that these ideals can move someone to self-sacrifice. And it's so hard to see that in a European context. And it's moving to see that somebody on the outside cannot really understand what Europeans have and be moved emotionally in a way that Europeans sometimes forget to be moved. Thank you very much, Ionela. It's interesting and somewhat surprising that this invasion, this hot war, is actually a break from the types of operations that Moscow had carried out quite successfully in the past, including against Ukraine. They used to prefer subversion, maintaining deniability, and so on. And a useful instrument in their arsenal was preserving frozen conflicts in a number of countries from the wider Black Sea area. And they used these to exert enormous pressure on these states and tested their resilience. David, could you tell us more about this type of conflict, and if the democratic model can find ways to mediate, appease, and eventually eliminate frozen conflicts?
Cristian, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I think it is a very good format for sharing ideas, especially in the situation where the Russian threat is becoming real, not only for Ukraine, but for other European countries too. At the beginning, I would like to mention that atrocities committed by Russian militaries in Ukraine have shocked the whole civilized world. I think before the aggression, until the last minute, we all had some hope that Putin would not take such a blatant risk to start open attack against sovereign Ukraine. However, after February 24th, the world woke up to a completely new reality, and immediately everything was named with their real names. Unfortunately, we must admit that for the past 15, 17 years, the West tried to avoid calling real names on the aggressive actions of Russia and has not responded adequately. But experience has shown that Russia understands only the language of power and sanctions. For him, negotiations and agreements are just a piece of paper. Putin considers the NATO enlargement and spread of democratic values in the territory of the former Soviet Union equally dangerous, because where there is autocratic rule, there is no room for democracy. Russia's influence on the former Soviet Republic is based mainly on hard forces. Of course, it is also actively used of element of hybrid warfare, and I will tell about it below on the case of Georgia. It is clear that under President Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine has accelerated the integration process with the West. Of course, Ukraine is a sovereign country and aspires for better development. Recent reforms in the country, strengthening of democratic values and changes in state institutions, of course, mean a strong European Ukraine. A developed and democratic Ukraine is clearly against the interest of the Kremlin, which rule is based on an autocratic nature. That's why Putin tries to use hard forces to bring Ukraine back into his sphere of influence. If we look at the Eastern Partnership countries, we will see that 5 out of 6 countries have conflicts. One seems Belarus without conflict. However, I think it's better to have conflict in the country rather than such a president as Lukashenko is. It's my point of view. The war in Ukraine, the conflicts in Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Nagorno-Karabakh, all are part of one common Russian strategy. The Kremlin acknowledges that it is unacceptable to attract and incapable for him to attract Eastern Partnership countries with economic development and democratic values. For him it's hardly difficult to do it. Consequently, it decided to create conflict zones in those countries. Putin thinks that while they have conflicts on their territories, they will be not welcomed and accepted by NATO and EU, especially by the Western Europe. Who wants countries with conflicts and many other problems in the European family? This is a core of the Kremlin's policy and strategy. Moreover, as we are well aware, the Kremlin has military presence in all above mentioned conflict zones, so-called frozen conflicts, but some of them are already not frozen. And they keep, it needs to keep power on the ground. Last place where he locked his troops was Nagorno-Karabakh. And after the 2020, so-called Russian peacekeepers already appeared in the territory also, in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now I move to Georgia. As a Georgian, I would like to mention that unfortunately, after the Russian aggression against Georgia in 2008, the West did not draw proper conclusions and did not make adequate reply to the Kremlin. Many security experts now believe that if the West had been as strong in its decision as it is now, Russia would not have dared to annex Crimea in 2014 and would not have invaded Eastern Ukraine afterwards. What did we have after 2014? The same mistake of the West, which was still trying to find common language with Russia. But we all see the consequences of such diplomacy. Unfortunately, currently, 20% of territory of Georgia is under Russian occupation. At the same time, alongside hard threats coming from the occupied territories, Georgia has to respond to Russian hybrid threats. It is on a daily basis. 14 years after the war, it must be said that Russia continued the war against Georgia, this time in a modified form. And of course, it is a hybrid warfare. Unfortunately, today, Russia has a solid background in Georgia, we have to admit it, be it TV channels or satellite proxy political parties. You probably are aware about the foundation Ruski Mir, which was created by Vladimir Putin by his decree in 2007. According to research done in Georgia, Ruski Mir Foundation indicates up to 46 entities from Georgia as its partners. Ruski Mir Foundation partner organizations in Georgia are mostly involved in two types of activities: supporting, organizing the Kremlin's political projects and educational and cultural projects. The educational and cultural activities carried out by Ruski Mir Foundation mostly involve opportunities to receive education in the Russian higher education institutions. They also organize free Russian language courses, cultural evenings, conferences, publishing newspapers and magazines, and making other events. According to pro-Kremlin media outlets, approximately 500 students from Georgia are studying now in Russia's higher educational institutions. For instance, for the academic year 2019, there were 120 places allocated for Georgia. At the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church has close ties with the Georgian Church. In addition, tens of Russian companies are operating in the country. Many of them are operating in strategically important areas. Many companies are in the energy sector, mobile network, metal industrial sector, etc. Meanwhile, Russian propaganda is trying to bring some nihilism and frustration in a vulnerable part of Georgian society. Do you see that you knock too many years the door of Europe? However, Georgians are not accepted by Europe. Why do you want to go to Europe? There is no morality or traditional families, and gay marriage is a common story there. Entering Europe will endanger your Orthodox culture and Georgian identity, and so on. Such narratives sadly confuse many people, but thanks to visa-free travel in Europe, many people have already seen with their own eyes the benefits and economic and democratic values that the West has, and therefore it is already difficult to deceive them. Fortunately, we have many pro-Western media companies and TV channels in the country, as well as political parties and non-governmental organizations, which are campaigning extensively to promote European values in society. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and sanctions imposed on Russia had an indirect impact also on Georgia. Hundreds of Russian citizens have started entering the country daily after the outbreak of the war. According to the official sources, after 24th of February, in just 2 months, nearly 70,000 of Russian citizens entered Georgia. Russians are buying real estate, starting business, and are feeling simply happy here. According to the government, they have a pragmatic approach to this issue. Government says that we have pragmatic approach. They say that Russians are bringing investments. Many of them come as a tourists, and it strengthens the economy of the country. However, unfortunately, some officials do not realize how much danger we may face in the long run. If the number of Russians entering our country will be the same in the coming months, this can lead to irreversible consequences. In this issue, I wouldn't agree with the official approach. I think we need to have more clear positions toward the mentioned issue in order to limit uncontrolled flow of Russian citizens to the country. In parallel with the above-mentioned developments, the Georgian government officially applied for EU membership in March. A few weeks later, we received the relevant questionnaire, and this questionnaire already has been completed and sent back to Brussels, and it was in the beginning of this month. However, some questions concerning standards still need to be democratic standards and democratic developments. It needs to be answered. From my point of view, when a country takes such a responsible step for the future of the country, there should be no room for doubt in the eyes of international partners in terms of adherence of democratic development. However, one thing is clear. EU membership is the main goal of the vast majority of the Georgian population. And this issue is far above any political party or influential individual. This is an issue that really unites us Georgians, and we are confident that Georgia, as well as Ukraine and Moldova, in spite of current difficulties and challenges, will soon become members of the European community. At this crucial moment, for us, it is important to stay together in order to reach our ultimate goal. At the same time, I believe that the West also should be more active towards countries such as Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova in order to encourage them to stay solid on the democratic track. We all are considered as successful countries of the Eastern Partnership, and it is undoubtedly important for us to receive clear messages of future cooperation from the European Union. And this is all what I wanted to say. And once again, thank you. Thank you, Cristian. Thank you for of your center. And I think so it was really a good opportunity for me to participate, and I will be happy to participate in similar events in the future. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, David. Louis, we have been listening so far to what people on the Eastern Partnership think about Europe, how they look up to Europe, how they use the European values as the backbone for their resilience. But it's an easy trap to fall into, believing that consolidated democracies are so robust, so resilient, that they are impervious to threats. But the reality couldn't be more different. You wrote extensively about far-right populism, particularly in post-communist countries. What do you think the war in Ukraine would do to this movement? They were not shy about espousing Russian rhetoric, and sometimes they were not above accepting financing from the Kremlin. So are these ties coming back to haunt them now? What do you think?
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. Just a quick note that my representation is the Baltic Defense College in Tartu, Estonia. No, that's okay. That's an interesting question because, first of all, right-wing populist parties are situationally adaptive, and they have a very keen capacity to come back from things that haunt them. A lot of talk has been devoted to Marine Le Pen, for example, who recently lost an election to Mr. Macron, and it was 58.5% for Mr. Macron and 41% for Madame Le Pen. A lot of talk was about the Russian ties coming back to haunt her, and I think that was just poor timing. I don't want to be pessimistic, and of course this is counterfactual, but had these elections taken place months and months after the war is ongoing, the optics of that may or may not change. But, it was celebrated by Le Pen's party at a national rally. She said, we will be back. This is not something that discouraged her. The game is not quite over. So even though she conceded defeat and didn't pull a Trump, she realized that was much better than the previous time. Now, if we look at two other actors who I think, for all of the talk about Salvini and Le Pen, that is definitely valid. Viktor Orban and Alexander Vučić, I think people should be paying more attention to because of the strategic allies they are for the Kremlin. Viktor Orban was recently re-elected with 53% of the national vote, earning him a fourth consecutive term, and he is much more useful to Vladimir Putin than any of the other populist radical right parties if they're in parliament making noise, but they're not necessarily in governing positions. Vučić is 60%. I mean, I don't know how much I trust the electoral system that he presides over, but in Hungary, I think it's safe to say that it was more being an EU member, more valuable to Vladimir Putin. And they are both Vučić and Orban, the most pro-Putin leaders prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And I don't think that that's changed after the war begun. I think that one of my sort of red thread arguments about how this will play out, and of course we don't know, is what are the optics going to be with this war. I mean, after the 24th of February, it became almost shameful for most people, maybe not for Gerhard Schroeder, but for most people to publicly support what the Kremlin was doing in Ukraine. As war crimes and other atrocities are uncovered, this becomes one of the, I would argue, the biggest litmus tests for these types of parties in terms of how they get around that. It was shortly after the 24th of February, Matteo Salvini was in a town in Poland. I don't remember which one, but the mayor pulled out a shirt that he had been donning a couple of months ago with Mr. Putin's face on it. And he said, I'm not going to give, something along the lines, I'm not going to give you an official welcome at the mayor's residence, but I will take you to the border where you can tell the Ukrainian people about your support for Mr. Putin. He had a chance, much like Gerhard Schroeder had a chance to publicly denounce Putin. Instead, he turned around and he walked away. So whether or not the Kremlin and certain oligarchs have anything on them remains to be unseen, but it does seem like they will not take a vocal step away. Now, Viktor Orban is a Machiavellian politician, of course, and the way he framed it was a lot like what you might expect an authoritarian populist to frame it, is that he wants to make sure that Hungary remains neutral and he will not agree to sanctions. And this is a choice between peace and stability or war and chaos. But I think it's also important to note that these parties are never down and out. I remember there was a lot of talk after Joe Biden won the US presidential election. Is this the end of populism? Well, I mean, no. Even if these people's careers are ruined by their association with Vladimir Putin, and that would be something that I would not protest, other people will come in to address the demand side of right-wing populism. And I should make 2 points before my time is up. Number one of the things you mentioned that I publish on, far-right, populist, radical right parties in Poland and in the Baltic states are not pro-Kremlin. Because being a nationalist in the Baltic state, being a Baltic nationalist actually does not align with that. And I don't think that the right-wing parties in Estonia or Latvia are pro-Kremlin at all. They even acknowledge that, okay, yes, there are some ideological alignments, but I think it really has to come down to ideology. And of course, this is something that I think we will start to maybe see, because it depends on how important Kremlin loans, Kremlin connections are. And that will likely change if the Russian economy starts to get worse, which right now it's bounced back. But the other thing that I wanted to touch base on is how these parties may or may not strategically maneuver in light of Europe really handling this crisis better than the sovereign debt crisis, than the refugee crisis, and really even than COVID. And with NATO having Sweden and Finland on board right now, that will, I think, also limit what the far-right populists can say in terms of cooperation, because this is something that has large support in Finland for obvious reasons. And I don't really think that we will see an end of this, and I don't really think that we'll see too many people backpedal to go out of their way to disassociate themselves with Vladimir Putin. But maybe I'm wrong. One of the things that I wanted to say, if I have a couple more minutes, is that
Sure, please do.
Yeah, is that I don't know if we look at how this illegal and atrocious war is received. I think the message that right-wing populists are going to have to come to terms with is that they're not necessarily going to be able to use their common deck of cards yet. They may in the future, because if repercussions of sanctions against the Russian Federation are felt, maybe this winter with high energy prices, that will lead to resentment. I think we're all positively surprised, or at least we were, a lot of people were, towards the beginning of this crisis, when support for Ukrainian refugees was overwhelmingly positive. It's likely that they will continue to come and to live in Europe, and it remains unseen when they can go back. There's a big question mark: which countries and how much, when will the welcome wear off? Of course, I hope that it does not, but maybe it would. And that is an opportunity, high energy prices and the welcoming mat wearing off for right-wing populists to pounce on that. But since this war is essentially the first social media war, public opinion, hashtags, likability, and the transfer of ideas and memes and anything on the internet that young people use and are familiar with is going to be an ideological battle. But right now, Ukraine and pro-Ukrainian partners are winning, but that needs to be, I think, kept up. And it would be very interesting to see. And I think that it will be much like COVID-19, that there's not a uniform stance from the populist radical right party family when it comes to the Russian Federation, just that it's really difficult for good optics for them if they publicly associate with Putin. But that concludes my very quick presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions and discuss with everyone else.
Thank you very much, Louis. And continuing on your strand of thought about possibly the number of Ukrainian refugees becoming a nuisance to Western European populations, we at the center have already sent out a warning that we feel that there is already a campaign being brewed in Kremlin, trying to use all patterns to create and stir animosity towards Ukrainian refugees, using the same patterns that we've seen used during the Syrian refugee crisis or during the pandemic. We see the same accounts being used, and we see some of the same narratives being agitated. And we did a pre-bunking exercise that we've publicized. So yeah, we are paying attention to that. We are absolutely seeing what you are warning us about. And because we have these two models, we really have to try to break the bubble, because inside Europe, things may look a certain way. We have a certain optic. But what do you think the outside world is making of all this situation? Because apparently there are two models of resilience when we talk about resilience, and democracies have a certain type of resilience. They are looking to preserve certain types of things, whereas autocratic regimes are interested in a completely different set of precious items to preserve. So for the rest of the world, how do you think the two models are being played out? Is it fair to use the same word, resilience, for the ability of the two types of government to preserve institutions and their relationship to power? I'm throwing this question out to all guests, so feel free to intervene.
Well, that's a great question, and I think that, of course, it depends on how you look at it. If you are a competitive authoritarian, or if you're simply a dictator, then preserving power of you yourself and potentially your inner circle is, of course, of prime importance. Those people don't necessarily care about elections. They don't care about elections destabilizing their foreign and domestic policy, quite simply because they can pull the strings and make them happen the way that they want them to happen. And I think that even if it looks to a lot of outside, I mean, I'm not an economist, but if it looks to outside observers that sanctions are taking too long, you have the Russian currency almost doubling after the central bank took steps to bolster the ruble, that will not last forever. And it's quite simply because a lot of people, even if they don't want to admit it, they believe in Europe. Or they believe in the West. I mean, that's where people go to live if they have the choice. That's where a lot of people from the Russian Federation go, from Mr. Putin's own country.
As we did during the Cold War.
Yeah. So I do think that we can talk about autocratic resilience, and that would be a very interesting Horizon Europe project, actually, because I think that that could tell us, depending on how things unfold, how these types of authoritarians react to shocks within their own systems.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Louis.
I would like to follow up with my ideas on this. So I personally believe that, as Louis mentioned, probably there are a lot of authoritarian leaders around the world watching very carefully what's happening in Ukraine, how Ukraine is responding, and also how the Western leaders are responding to the Ukrainian war, because it also very important moment of showing how resilient are the Western Euro-Atlantic democratic institutions. On one side, European Union, on the other side, NATO. How, if they are able to basically walk the talk. Because we have all these rules, but now we are in this situation where both organizations have to implement and show their resilience in face of the Russian aggression. We don't have a pressure only on Ukraine. We have also the pressure on the European countries, on our institutions. So it's very important for not only the democratic institution, but also for the idea of multilateral institution, how multilateralism will survive this moment. Because we know before the war, we were talking about the New World Order, and that we are in this moment of changing from unipolarism and the moment of United States to multipolarism, many great powers around the world. And there was also a moment of doubt about the multilateral system. Is multilateralism only a democratic product, or is multilateralism changing into something that, I don't know, the states making it? If we are approaching this from a constructivist perspective. So the idea for me is that nowadays we see that not only what's happening in Ukraine is important, and the resilience, it's not only about the resilience of Ukrainian state in face of the Russian threats, it's also about the resilience of the European security architecture per se, on one side, then the resilience of the democratic organization and the resilience of these multilateral cooperation agreements, if they are standing to all this pressure.
Indeed, and we really have to thank the American people for electing the current administration, because I'm pretty sure that if they had chosen differently, the world would have been a very different place right now. David, would you have anything to add?
I think I already answered partially on these questions because I mentioned the war in Georgia in 2008, and there was a lack of response, and the international community didn't draw the proper conclusions, and then that's why it happened Crimea in 2014, and after that, where the West tried to find again the common language of Putin's regime, and so it needs more pressure on autocracy. Because they understand only language of sanctions and pressure. More pressure and pressure on them in order to change their mind. It's my conclusions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. And if you have any final thoughts to share with our listeners, now would be an excellent time to do so.
I do, and I'm glad you touched upon the American election, because I think, and to tack on to what Ionela said, it seems like right now the EU and NATO are very resilient, and they have adequately, more than adequately, they've amply addressed this horrible crisis. But I think the point that you made about the election, especially in a two-party system, the United States being the power that it is globally, it reminds us that elections do have consequences, and that these cleavages will be exploited by the Kremlin in the future. And I think that it's really up to everybody, especially young people who are thinking about getting into the policy world, the academic world, the political world, to remember that this is really the first social media war, and opinions do matter, and sharing and spreading the truth does matter. And if you read Anton Tchaikovsky wrote a really interesting article on the Euromaidan Press, and he basically makes the point that it sometimes feels like the Russian Federation has adopted the UN definition of genocide in their war on Ukraine. So I don't want to paint a bleak or grim picture of the future, but it's an important time to be a young person in politics and academia. And so it was a pleasure for me to be on this panel, and I enjoyed sharing our thoughts and insight into very important policy matters.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all, Ionela, David, Louis, for this very illuminating talk. And thank you to all our viewers for their attention. We will be with you again next week with the new exciting topics and fantastic guests. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.